Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones, the unvisited ones, the cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome back to the show good friend and one of our most popular returning guests, Langston Kahn. Langston is a shaman, educator, activist, and community leader. And now, he can also add author to that list because he joins us today on the occasion of the launch of his excellent first book, Deep Liberation, Shamanic Tools for Reclaiming Wholeness in a Culture of Trauma. Enjoy. Langston, welcome back.
Thank you, Gordon.
Well, you've been on the show a few times and we've done some, things together in person, but you were here because like a milestone in your own life, which is the new book. So congratulations, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really exciting for it to finally be out in the world after kind of being in hermit mode, just toiling away on it on my own.
Yeah, well, it's funny. We caught up a bit during the process of you writing the book. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it is your first book. So tell us about the process. Why did you write it? And what were some things that you kind of learned about yourself and books going through the process? Because the first one, at least from my experience, is a wild ride.
It definitely was a wild ride. And I remember reaching out to you during that process and appreciating your encouragement to expect the, the wildness and all the turmoil of the writing process. But yeah, for me, it all started when I realized I was at a place in my life where I had put a lot of investment and time and energy and resources into mastering or entering into a path of mastery with different lineages. That includes like different lineages of the African diaspora, that includes some of the ancestral work that I do, that includes the work with the Last Mass Center and shamanic healing that I do. I had really spent years mastering the technologies of these lineages, at various stages of the path. And so a lot of my work, aside from just my personal business of one-on-one healing work and supporting people, was about bringing these visions into the world. And I realized I was at a point where I really needed to feel more into what was the vision I was being guided in this moment to bring into the world myself. And I needed something that was going to sort of ask all of me to complete it. So that like all of my, triggers and shit and just problematic stuff was going to come up and get, activated in the process of doing it. I was going to have to face it if I was going to make it through. And in that process of trying to feel it, so why isn't it natural? Like, in my beliefs, my teachings, like our vision, the vision of our life is always right here being offered to us, not some mysterious thing someplace outside of us. So I was like, why isn't it here now? Like, why aren't I feeling logically that next thing that I want to fully give myself to in this way and surrender to? And what I realized is that I still held this dream of being a filmmaker, because I don't know if many people know, I went to film school. I went to NYU for film. And I was pretty active in film in terms of doing production design on sets and writing my own stuff and making stuff. But as my life diverged from that path, really after kind of some of my initiatory crisis, so to speak, and healing path that I started on, I really pulled away from film. And I always kept the idea that I'd come back to it, that I'd keep doing screenwriting. And, I'd write every now and then. I'd get involved in friends' projects and give them, support on their stuff every now and then. But I realized there was this part of me that thought the only time I get to express my creativity is in that arena, in film, because that's what I've chosen. That's what I've invested the resources and time in. And everything else is just the other parts of my life. They're not my creativity. And so there was this like lie of separation around my own creative process, and filmmaking had just become this one more excuse to deny my creativity. And so I ritually decided to actually kill that dream of filmmaking. And you know, who knows if it'll ever come back in the future, but I just really let it die ritually. And within you know, I'd already started thinking about a book as a possible project, but I hadn't really fully committed that much to it. And within 2 weeks of me doing that ritual and starting to really put my energy and creativity into the practice of writing this book, trying to solidify what I had learned these past 10 years, like the foundation of what I've learned around what makes human transformation possible and sustainable. Um, Within 2 weeks of that, I received a query from a publisher if I was writing something and if I'd be interested in talking with them about it. So it just felt like this good listening to life as a teacher, that okay, yeah, you needed to really let that dream die and stop. I remember there was this point where I literally went inside my inner landscape and I saw it as this like black rotting stuff around my like sacral chakra that was just like obscuring my vision and obscuring my creativity, because I was saying it was my dream, but I was never actually putting the bulk of my energy and time and resources into that dream.
So what does a ritual look like? How do you kill Langston Scorsese?
Yes, exactly. Well, that's part of it. It's like the first step was really going inside and finding the me that held that dream, and sort of understanding why they were still holding that dream, and seeing if I could give them sort of an honorable death, like honoring the choices they made that got me to this point, but letting them know I no longer wish to carry them forward. So that was one component that was more sort of the internal ritual. But then the actual rituals is very simple. It was like a fire ritual. I was drawing on my relationship with fire as an element and as one of the eldest ancestors in my tradition, my shamanic practice. You know, grandfather fire, please be here now. I need your help. I need to let this dream die. It's hard. I have a lot of grief around letting this die. I've invested countless hours and time and hopes and like futures, possible futures that I know I will be killing in letting this dream die. So I need your help to enter into this risk of letting this go. Please help me to kill it thoroughly and let it go from my life at this time. And then making offerings as I'm saying those prayers, making a sort of beautiful fire shrine space for the fire. And this is in my New York apartment, so I don't have like a bonfire or anything. I have like a tea light, but with like a nice altar set up around that feels like the energy of grandfather fire to me. And then I've put into a power object, which for me, I like to use sort of like origami paper and do these kind of collage cutout pieces that feel like they embody the energy, that just kind of go into a mild trance state and create as I'm thinking about the pattern I'm trying to release. And then I burn it in the fire. And I usually, before I burn it, I'm also sort of like trying to dance it or embody that pattern a bit to really get it into that object thoroughly. And then I'm giving it to fire, making some more offerings and songs to fire and thanks, and then letting it go.
Yeah, I like it. It's sort of really germane for I think a lot of people at the moment. Although I mean, this process began before everything that happened last year began. I spoke with Connor a couple of weeks ago on our New Year's show about having to take the time to grieve things or trajectories in my life that I liked that aren't going to happen. That's why I was like, I'm interested for the show, and I'm interested personally in what that ritual looked like, because I sort of had a kind of a funereal approach, and it worked, but I think yours might have been faster.
Yeah, well, how we work with fire in my tradition is when we want instantaneous transformation. Like there's all different types of rituals in terms of like, slow composting earth rituals, or, more kind of cleansing or reconciling water rituals, or these sort of over time wearing away of air rituals. But when you want that like lightning bolt of spirit touching down a specific place in your life, that's fire that we generally work with. And um, it's deceptively simple when you describe it, but when you're in the experience of it, and then in the aftermath of it, that's when the real interesting stuff happens. In my tradition, we generally talk about how there's 2 weeks after a fire ritual where life is, and the spirit world is saying, oh, did you really want to give that up? Are you sure? And putting all this stuff kicking up in your face that gives you opportunities either to make the same old choice that you used to make around this pattern you've said you wanted to give up, or to hold the line and not step back into that old pattern. And if you can make it through the ordeal of those 2 weeks, then the next 2 months are often very much about a feeling of that pattern being lifted radically off of you by the elements. And it's your job now just to make the new choices that allow, when that pattern drops back down to be composted into the earth, you're no longer standing in the same place, so it doesn't drop back down onto you.
I like it. So the book exists to some extent because I'm putting words in your mouth, but go with me on this, because you freed your creativity to so that it can express outside of a preordained channel that's probably that no longer serves and is probably not going to happen, or is like a low probability option. So it was a process of breaking it free, I guess. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think that is fair. And in terms of the why I chose the book as the vehicle for my creativity, I was just looking at my life and seeing, like, out of all the work I'm doing, because I'm doing a lot in terms of teaching and work with clients and leadership and other communities I'm part of, what am I spending my time doing? What am I actually choosing to spend my time doing that I feel moved to do? And what am I seeing people actually responding to in a way that their lives are being changed by what I'm doing? I'm seeing an impact to what I'm doing. And when I really looked at that honestly, not just what I would like that to be, what it actually was, I realized that I needed to spend my time putting out into the world the sort of the foundation of the work that I've seen create the most change in my life and in others' lives, so I can do other things. So I can be freed up to do other things once I get that out into the world in this way.
Yeah, so that I think that's what I was looking for, because it's a ritual bomb. I haven't read a book in a long time that is so jam-packed with the actual doings and ongoings of ceremony. There's, if you think about a shape of a book like this, not like this, but in this genre, I guess, there's a little suggested exercise at the end of a chapter of a bunch of takes, and your book, I feel here's everything that here are the actual doings that got me to where I am on my journey. It feels like that, I guess.
Yeah, and that's absolutely a big energy in the book. Like, here, let me give it to you as much as possible, because I literally, when I got to the end of the book writing process, I ended up having to cut out 6 chapters because it was just too long. No one was going to read this book if it was as long as when I first wrote it. Yeah.
Well, so I mean, we spoke about that. Tell people what the thesis of the book is.
Yeah. So the thesis of the book really is that right now, when I wrote it, it wasn't a very hard sell, and it's even an easier sell now in this time. But because I started writing this before COVID even happened, and I started really writing it in March of 2019. And what I felt was, we are at a time where so many imbalances and failures of contemporary culture are being laid bare, and we have a lot of people who want to create something new. And yet, in a lot of ways, it feels like there isn't as much progress happening as we might need to get somewhere new before we move on a suicidal path of, death of at least humanity, if not lots of other life forms on Earth. And so I wanted to look at, why is that? And what I saw as why is that actually came to me in a vision of my ancestors, where they handed me this book, and it was almost like a flip book. It wasn't like words. It was just this heart being broken open over and over again, and then reforming and breaking and getting bigger until it like just became the whole book was the heart. And what I felt from that as I was feeling into that vision was that right now we are only ever going to succeed in recreating slightly more comfortable versions of the same systemic problems if we aren't willing to be radically transformed ourselves in the process of changing the systems we're working to change. And how we do that cannot be a collapse from the place of a collapse into the mess that we're in, because that just results in like, depression and paralysis if we're just constantly being mired in all the suffering and pain in the world right now. But we also can't just bypass into the future we're trying to move towards and be one of the people who's like, I only like positive people, good vibes only, like everyone has to follow this vision, and everyone who isn't following this vision is sucks and is terrible, and I'm just, we can't do that either, because that also doesn't create any real change. It just keeps us into a sense of like tyranny and despotism and control and this pattern of bypass, really. And so we need to be able to hold both. We need to be able to hold the truth of the horrible mess we're in, the huge gap that we've created as humanity over the past, century or so, and between where we could be as humanity and where we are, like where we could be in terms of our role in relationship to the great dream of all of life versus where we are currently. And we have to be able to feel that gap, be in it, and also feel the truth of the love available to us, the vastness of resources available to us, and the vision we're moving towards, and hold both of those simultaneously. And from the place of that, which is a very creative place, the place of that, discomfort of that tension, structural tension between these two poles, be making our choices from that place, because that's where we actually have traction. And so we can only do that if we're willing in the process of doing that to let our hearts be broken. And when they break, not just letting them scar over and shrink, oh, I don't do that anymore because this happened to me once, but doing the work to reclaim the aspects of ourself that heartbreak is revealing to us. We're already lost in fears and beliefs and harmful stories, and bring them back into our wholeness so we can repair our heart in a way that it's bigger than when we started out.
I like it. I just, tangential to the book, because it suddenly occurs to me, you've been on the show and I've known you for, gosh, like almost a decade now when you think back. What is it with you and the heart?
Yeah, thank you for that. What is it with me and the heart? Since I was so young, that was so, my mom tells this ridiculous story of when I was like in elementary school, and I think it was first grade probably, and I came home and I was furious. I was so angry, and she's like, what's wrong? And I was like, Mom, the kids at school were talking about Barney, that, I don't know if people know that show, but that old TV show with dinosaurs, and they were saying that it didn't make sense and it was a stupid show because a triceratops would never be friends with a T-Rex. And I said, but it's not about dinosaurs, it's about love. And so it was the weird thing of obsession I've always had since I was little with the nature of love. And not love as this idea of romantic love, but that kind of deep force of the universe that is available to all of us, that is constantly trying to initiate us into the vastness of who we actually came here to be, that kind of love. And the heart for me is the site of where we access and can receive and transmit that love. And so I think for me, I've always been obsessed with technologies for opening to feeling more of that love. And when I was a little, Black queer kid, mostly how that expressed itself was like painful, excruciating loneliness and desire for a relationship. That was usually how that came through. But then as I moved forward on my healing journey and my sort of initiatory path and my shamanic teachings, and really actually had visceral experiences of what I think I actually was wanting, but in our culture, I only had the face of romantic love to grasp for. Um, I just since then I just am always been obsessed with how do we do that as humanity? How do we access that love in a way that we can share it with each other and share it with ourselves? Because it just everything else seems boring to me.
Yeah,
Everything it
that's
like yeah.
interesting. Yeah. So what I was wondering is if presumably somewhere very early along your journey, because it's like this, over the last year or so, it's become apparent that people need urgently need a heart practice to get through what's going on. And amongst the membership, we've done different variants of the rosary. And if people want to do chakra stuff, go for it, whatever. But was there somewhere early on in your journey, and I feel like there must have been, given, the URL and all the rest of it, where you encountered a practice that the heart is a potent, hate the word symbol, but is a potent archetypal symbol for a lot of the stuff and its transformative power that you were just saying. And was there a moment early on that you can recall where you encountered like, oh wow, like this is actually a way of activating and being with it? So it's not love in a diffuse sense. There's actual ceremonial tech that that is about this, that because it just, I don't know, do you know what I mean? Was there something there where you're like,
Mhm.
wow, this is actually something I can lean into and expand?
Yes. Yeah. And there was a lot of those little moments because it's not, at least in my experience, it's rarely something that just suddenly bowls you over. It's more over time you receive different layers of it. So I'm trying to think back to some of those earliest experiences, and I think one of them was, well, early on in my shamanic teachings, we do this thing called the true love journey, actually, where we engage in these different questions to actually experience the force of true love in the universe, in a sense. And that moment was big for me in that I think that was when I first started to be able to articulate what I just shared, of that feeling of this energy that's always there trying to remind us of who we are as an aspect of what love feels like and what love is. Who we already are, who we always have been, who we always will be. That level of essence. And I think when I really ground that into my like day-to-day life, the times when I've most felt that flowing through me, which in Chinese medicine you might call it this feeling of like shen, that overflowing of qi impregnating the body, that just like tears streaming out of the eyes, this feeling of connection to all living things. The times when I've felt that has really been in community, when I've engaged in deep transformative ritual practice, and we've sort of showed up for each other through that process. And then on the other side of that, we're feeling all that we've done together that we couldn't have done without that connection to each other. And that feeling just starts flowing, that sort of vibrates out from that interpersonal love to this deeper force that's flowing through all of us. And it's a frustrating how much this falls apart when you try to put it to words, versus the experience of it. But yeah, I would say those are some of the moments that stick out as these big moments of engaging with this force, and not saying that as better or than you know love between two individuals of like romantic love and relationship. I think it's very related, but just not confining it to only that.
Yeah, fair enough. Cool. No, I was, yeah, idly wondering, I guess, where yeah, you and the heart go way back, and it's interesting as a symbol or an archetype that has transformed you and you used to transform, is just something that I was sitting with. But returning to the book, I was listening to Alberto Villoldo the other day talking about how in the West and in America in particular, what what we have is a disease care system rather than a healthcare system, and I
Mhm.
like that. And so on a returning to the book, what's, I guess, the theory of healing that underpins it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I like that. I like that metaphor, the disease care system. I mean, or labeling of the disease care system. I think what might help to understand the model of healing in the book is the archetype of healer in this tradition. So how we talk about the archetype of healer in this cosmology is not as what comes in and heals us when we are diseased. That's sort of what's happening when the horse is already out of the barn, so to speak. So it's more about that force. And again, archetypes in this way of thinking is, I think, was similar to how Jung was thinking, as we've talked about in past podcasts, are not solely gods or stories or myths, but these things that are beyond human protocol and story and are found in every living thing, plants and animals. And so the healer is that force that teaches us what we uniquely need to be well in the moment. Like, what do we need in this moment to be in a state of health and well-being? And for the common denominator of answers for all of life is to be in the present moment, where we have the actual power to create change. Because from most shamanic cosmologies, the idea of where disease comes from, in a sense, is being stretched out across time. So we have aspects of self that are stuck in moments from the past, aspects of self that are stuck in fears of the future or certain limited ideas of what the future could be or has to be. And in those gaps where we're stretched out, disease enters in. So the healer teaches us how do we come into the present moment. And so the fundamental core of this philosophy of healing in this book is, how do we learn tools and practices that allow us to proactively engage with our life as a teacher and unpack the ways life is constantly trying to initiate us, and in doing so become people who can respond fully to what the present moment is asking of us, to let those archetypal intelligences that are always working to move through us throughout our day, like, for example, seeing someone who needs help and rushing in to help, like that warrior just coming through you, to be able to just open, to be, what the Lakota people would call like a hollow bone, let me be a hollow bone. That feeling of just being able to open to what the moment is calling from you and act in the moment.
That's cool. I think I like that idea of well, I like all of it, but the idea of finding what the moment is asking of you, and what this moment is from an initiatory perspective. And you mentioned archetypes. One of the things that I think one of my perhaps favorite parts in the book is around archetypal clearing, which you got like halfway to just then, but like what specifically is archetypal clearing?
Yeah, let's talk about that. So first, I might say just that I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around archetypes in our culture, and that was one of the ways we first met at the Psychoanalysis, Art, and the Occult conference, where I was talking about Jung and archetypes and shamanism. And I think um, with much of like pop psychology and understanding of archetypes, we're referring to archetypes as gods, as as stories, as myths, versus understanding that there are these forces that are beyond the human, that are in a sense the source code of the universe.
Yeah.
And I think that was what, like, if you read Jung's writings, he explicitly states that multiple times. But I think then, um, in the teachings of the cycle transformation, we sort of expand that and take it to the nth degree of really looking at if right now, like we were talking about, we're in a time when humanity is largely turned away from life, that we've decided we can insulate ourselves from the reality of the rest of life on Earth and just go on our merry way, and nothing wrong is going to happen. And there's going to be endless resources to fund that project. We need help from energies that aren't so wrapped up in human protocol and the choices humans have made. So we need to engage with archetypes as these source code that can remind us what it feels like to be in an affirming relationship with life versus an anti-life, relationship with all of creation. And in my experience, so what can happen when we don't have things like initiation into adulthood that's supported by a community of elders is, as we're moving through our childhood without adults in our life who have a sense of the archetypal realm and how to, like, instruct children in engagement with these archetypes, we naturally have to access them anyway. There's moments when we need healing. There's moments when we need, warriorship. There's moments we need to lead ourselves or to teach ourselves or to, enter into our sovereignty to a new level or enter into our visioning state. And so we reach for these archetypes. We don't really have models for them. And often we're wrapped up in a lot of fear or trauma that we're experiencing in the moment that we're reaching for them. And so we develop distorted relationships with these archetypes that you might call archetypal shadows. Because another way that I think I differ, I think what I call shadow work is very different than what a lot of people talk about as shadow work. And what I call shadows are different. And so some people might call like the wounded child or the wounded healer as an archetype. And I would say, no, those are archetypal shadows. Because if we were to say the wounded child is an archetype, we would be saying all children must be wounded. All children must be in a state of wounding. And so that's how I differentiate kind of between shadows versus archetypes. So shadows are like what happens when the archetype tries to come through us and gets caught up on our own baggage and fears and distorted beliefs. And so for example, we're trying to enter into that being in the present moment that's needed and following the path of our healing, but instead we decide that the best way to care for ourselves is to care for others. And that might have started in childhood because our parent was someone who was, let's say, an alcoholic who was really struggling to keep it together. And so we took care of a lot of their needs in this sort of pattern of codependency. And then that over time, we learned that's how you heal. That's how you stay in the present moment. That's how you get your needs met, by caring to others' needs and managing the emotions of others around you. So we develop this shadow of the healer, of the martyr, or the endless caretaker, and whenever healer tries to move through us into our life, instead these patterns of martyrdom come out. So archetypal clearing is moving inward and finding these aspects of self that are stuck in these distorted patterns with archetypes, and showing up for those aspects of self in a way that lets them drop those old roles, feel safe enough to trust us, to drop those old roles and allow a new relationship with that archetype to form.
I like it. It's one of the things, I think we spoke about it in London, but what ultimately freed archetypes for me, or allowed them, so that I could come to an understanding if they're either inhumanity or non-humanity, which is what you were talking about before. We do have a tendency to turn them into humans when they're patterns in the universe, was permaculture, because Bill Mollison, the thing that interested him the most, and basically anyone who does their design certificate the least, is the pattern understanding that underpins what I would now call custodianship, but like land management or permaculture. Because if you look at the things that rivers do, they are self-similar and express the same way around the world because of essentially how the universe is built. And it's the same thing with sun aspect and the self-similar shape of a mountain and all that kind of fractal stuff, although he got to this before we ended up with the Mandelbrot set. And it's that kind of idea that in permaculture design, the river is going to, well, the pattern that underpins how rivers work or how water moves across landscape is going to be the same. And if you build your structures wrong, like if you build in a way that is not in harmony with how that pattern expresses in the universe, your house will flood or your dam will collapse or whatever it happens to be. And it's that, whereas if you are in alignment with the expression of pattern on landscape, you are essentially in a state of infinite or free energy, because you've made sure that you are, that your plants are perpetually watered by the function of the universe, and they get the right sun and all the rest of it. And permaculture is the eternal quest for pattern alignment. And what you were sort of saying there about shadow archetypes and essentially getting out of the way and allow them to express in your life is very permacultural to me. And I think that's maybe, I don't know if I'd describe it quite like that in London, but that was like, it took permaculture for me to move out of the very common misconception of archetype.
Yeah, I think when we were speaking in London, you were probably just starting to really delve and dive into permaculture, and so yeah, it was all happening at that same time. That's so yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful example. And it goes back to that understanding that if something is truly an archetype, it makes sense when you look at the plant world. It makes sense when you look at the animal world. It's not
Yeah,
just
if you want to
making sense
know
in the
what
human
like
world.
that was the first night on ayahuasca in the jungle.
Mm,
She showed me what, because it always seemed odd if she's like a mother. It always seemed odd that her, until I'd encountered her, her common expression as a serpent was, because we
mhm.
associate maternal instincts with organisms that are more like us, like mammals and even birds, and less so with snakes. And so she spent about an hour showing me how a snake can be a mother, and the thoughts and thinking that goes on in a snake mind when it's selecting somewhere to lay its eggs or her eggs, and even having to move them, carrying them in her mouth, and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, and it was this sort of great unfolding of the archetype of a mother, which we may encounter in our lives because we have mothers, but that's not what the archetype is. It's this pattern underneath, the cosmos. And it was a really interesting kind of overlap of my understanding of permaculture, because obviously we have multi-generational animals on the farm, and so mothers are in play. And it's been why I will never, because I know it's kind of trendy to, at least amongst academia, to not like Jungian stuff. Uh, the people who don't like it don't garden, because if you do, you will see that archetypes is the right word for, I think, and probably you do too, what Jung was getting at. It is inhuman in the good sense, or non-human, and it expresses in everything, including the human.
Yes, exactly. And one thing I like to say, some people love to take that and then instantly turn it into like some kind of righteous positionality. Like, I only work with archetypes. I don't like muddy myself with the gods, all those human constructs, And I just want to clarify that's not at all what I'm saying, because gods are just another part of this beautiful permaculture ecology of the universe that we're all part of. So we couldn't, even if we wanted to, say, oh, I just never engage with gods, because they're
Yeah.
here too. And
And
so
exactly, and
yeah.
so you're actually missing that would, again, to stay with the permacultural metaphor or framework, you are that is an improper system, because we are, dare I say, supposed to be in, we are at least supposed to be in some kind of relation with forms like gods and spirits as part of the functioning of the universe. Like this, we agree on this, but I think humans are designed for ceremony, or built for ceremony, or
Mhm.
whatever we want to call it, right? So I agree.
Absolutely.
It's funny. It's like, oh, I only work with the archetypes. They're not really, if we're keeping the permaculture metaphor going, we're not, you don't really work with the pattern of water. You just get the pattern of water. It's not like you say, oh, I work with the river pattern. It's like, yeah, you just get it. Like, it's going to happen on your property anyway. Whereas there are, when you're dealing with spirits and ancestors and beings and things, you can work with them, because they're also in relation to you and archetypal forces and so on.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and in a sense, this is one aspect of what I tried to say very briefly, maybe even a little too briefly, in the beginning of the book, around why I still use the term shamanism versus animism has become so popular in practitioners, especially I see, non-indigenous practitioners, of wanting to not be appropriative by using the word shamanism, which I think is a good thing, because so much damage and harm has been done with the appropriation of that word and the misuse of it. And to me, Mircea Eliade spending, the Romanian religious scholar, I should say, spending his significant academic capital to say to the world at that time, often the academic Western world, shamans are not crazy, that people hold these roles in cultures all around the world, a specialist role, and it's part of our human legacy. And it they're not just hucksters or crazy people. I think allowed us to see a missing gap in contemporary Western culture that was a necessary gap to look at and poke at. And then, we get, Carlos Castaneda, who brings in the fact that you can't just study these people. Like Mircea Eliade never actually, been with shamans. He just read about them in anthropological texts. And so he actually says, no, actually, you have to experience time with these people, which of course, there's all sorts of problems about Mircea Eliade. There's all sorts of problems about Carlos Castaneda and his messed up stuff. But he brings forward that idea that you can't be an objective observer, you have to be an active participant to really understand and relate to these concepts. And then we get, Michael Harner, who comes in and creates the Foundation for Shamanic Studies and Core Shamanism, which I have all sorts of problems with. But in his divorcing of these technologies for engagement with a shamanic worldview from their cultural context and making them palatable to Westerners, he manages to start reviving in some ways the active use of these tools in the contemporary Western world. And then that creates all sorts of problems out of that and harm that's done because of the appropriation, the lack of cosmology that's being held within those tools. Because if there's no cosmology, then what happens is you are simply shoehorning these great spiritual technologies into the cosmology of capitalism and just learning how do I be a better capitalist with the spirit world,
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
No, I like that. And because obviously my next book is about animism. So there's a whole bit about the word, and we spoke about it earlier too, like the word shamanism. Bayo Kamalafe talks about how the place you make sanctuary is where there is the crack, right? And so to use these terms with awareness is to go to Donna Haraway now, to stay with that particular trouble. Because if you just be like, shamanism, that is that capitalist extraction happening, where you can it is the final piece of the imperial project to hoover up the invisible treasures, having spent 4 centuries hoovering up the visible ones. It's the final extraction. But if you stay in that space of like, this is a tension point, but if we value frameworks and cosmovisions that are different to the ones we were born in, there needs to be a place of tension or trouble that we stay in, where we will do our best to allow them to be what they are. And crucially, and I'm glad you mentioned the difference between Mircea and Carlos there, right? I'm just going to give them their first names. Because one of the things that my book addresses in detail is the way we validate truth in a quote unquote Western context is by referencing other books. So it's a literary method of validating truth, and that is one of the ways that's prevented the healthy contact between frameworks or cosmovisions, because basically the rest of them don't. The rest of them have a ceremonialized, performed in-person, experiential, phenomenological center. And so I think that's a nice thing to say about Castaneda's work, that it is in fact that pivot, and it kind of moves further on from there. But I see, I don't know what else we can do if we deem these to be both valuable and urgent, other than to sit with the trouble of those words, right? Like, because it's funny, like you can't, the idea of solving it, this is really Bayo Kamalafe, the idea of solving it is part of the Western framework. It's like, okay, well, let's all sit down and think how to fix this. And it's like, no, that solutionism is actually the Western framework that will trap it and hijack it. There's nothing to do but sit with that trouble and I guess attempt to not necessarily make sanctuary, that's the wrong word, but it's kind of the right word, because inside sanctuary is the opportunity to explore the multifarious form. So I'm really glad you kind of used that word, and it's one of the reasons, at least for the next book, Animistic, it's one of the reasons I'm using animism for that same, and dare I say worse, colonial damage, right? So it actually requires people to sit with that term. And I've sort of been very explicit on a couple of shows recently with Catherine, who was at our Metaphysics of Desire workshop. I do that deliberately, and I only took, like, when I say I'm an animist, I mean that I am embedded in the intellectual framework of, I guess, colonial truth making that gives us that term, because I can't like project an imperial term onto Indigenous Australians and say they're animists and I want to be that. Like it doesn't. You have to sit in the tension of the framework, because somewhere in there is um, the least worst or potentially even most healing way of encountering other cosmovisions. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. And I would say, you know, yeah, so animism in an academic context until fairly recently, like the last like 5, 10 years or so, was really used primarily to talk about the primitive. Like,
Yeah,
oh yes, animistic, yeah. And so, and I hear that's what you're saying, in terms of like sitting in that trouble of that gap, and hopefully being able to weave something new versus saying, because I am animist, that means I'm just like these Aboriginal people that I also am labeling animist under my way
yeah,
of thinking. And
exactly.
that's
Like
yeah,
we've been doing that since Europeans showed up in Australia. We've been calling them animists, and we should stop.
yeah, yeah,
Like,
exactly. Like that's my term, so I should be the one using it. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so why I use the term shamanic versus animist, though I like that too, is I think animism, not all animist cultures are also what I would call shamanic, to use, Eliade's original definitions in
sure.
terms of this specific, like cultures that have this specific ritual role of someone who has attained a certain level of initiation that then tends the balance between the individual and their own soul, the family and the individuals, the community and the families, and the environment and the like the plants and animals and ecosystem and the spirit world with the community.
Yeah, I like it.
And yeah, so not every culture has that role, and the cultures that do have specific beliefs and principles that go along with having someone in that role. And so that's the space that I'm interested in exploring, that gap of what does it look like when we try to reclaim the ability to engage that role in our culture? Not even what does it look like to have shamans again. I'm not even worried about that as much as what does it look like for each of us to choose to show up as practitioners that are engaging the beliefs and principles you find in all cultures you might label as shamanic within this context and this definition, which of course is a colonial definition. What does it look like to begin to try to repair and remember and regrow ways of meeting the challenges of the unique time we're in alignment with those beliefs and principles?
I love it. It turns out, well, I'm hunting a different whale, which is why I like the term animist, because that's all completely correct, and I'm glad. I'm not surprised, but it's really exciting to hear you explain something you've clearly thought through, which is why you're using these terms, which is cool. Because mine, especially with this book, when when Tyler first used the term animism or animist, it was in reference to primitive societies who had childlike minds because they couldn't understand the difference between dreams and reality, and they thought that trees had dreams, and so like the term is pejorative specifically around a naive theory of mind. Now the kicker, it turns out, is that with several centuries and even inside something like a materialist naturalist psychology, the kicker is he was describing as primitive what is in fact a better and healthier theory of mind from a place of his own enlightenment primitivism. And so for me, it's not, it's weird to say call it an intellectual exercise because that's disembodied, but it is a theory of mind exercise to stay with the term animist, or to sit with the trouble of the term, because you're look. I love that what you're saying about what does it look like to have uh, the framework of a shaman either in your life or in cultures, and the framework of a shaman, what he or she does is that, yeah, border and balance tending for tribes and persons and so on. That's really cool. I love that. But I'm glad, it's funny, you describing that has allowed me to sort of boil down or encapsulate what it is, and it's a theory of mind exercise, or I'm staying with the fraught concept of theory of mind because I'm really struck by the idea that the early descriptions of primitive cultures as animist actually look like, again, even in materialist naturalist psychology as we have it today, a healthier theory of mind. It's
Hmm.
just the inversion of it is too exciting not to play with for me.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's very exciting. And I think another piece that maybe I didn't quite emphasize is just when you have someone in that human role, they're embodying a similar role as the first shaman in their culture. So, who is the first shaman? You know, the first shaman, this is something I talk about in the book as well. The first shaman is that person who's often coming in the legends cross culturally during a time when the world is out of balance, when humanity has lost their way. Maybe it's the end of a world, or maybe it's the beginning of a new world. When you look at these indigenous ideas, these cyclical time and these ages of man, um, there's this way that the first shaman comes in and says, okay, I take pity on you humans. We're going to learn how to do this again. We're going to learn how to come back into relationship with the plants, with the animals, with each other in a way that allows us to be in service to life again. And so we're going to get you out of this tough spot you're in where, you know, you're not having enough food, people are dying, people are being cruel to each other, and we're going to remember how things once were and how things could be again. And so then every shaman after that has to strive to be working at the level of this sort of often demigod that is the first shaman, and living at that access between the human and spirit world. And what I see with animism is this acknowledgement that everything is a spirit, which is true and beautiful, but not necessarily the ways we can relate to those energies as in our human way, in a way that they truly become our family, and that we're connected to in this way that sort of like the first shaman in a sense reminds us how to do.
Yeah, I love it. I think that's a really splendid way of putting those concepts in relation, which is, which is what we should do. I think that's an important distinction. Almost like a trick question: is the first shaman an archetype?
I would say I would say maybe perhaps shaman is an archetype. I think I would say the first shaman more gets into territory of ancestors.
Yeah, okay, I like it. Because I wasn't sure if it was either. I think it might be an initial instantiation of an archetype.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think it might be and again, this is mythic in the sense of always true, never happened. I think it's uh, where that archetype makes contact with humanity and what it looks like. Yeah, cool. So, Lucky Blessing, we were chatting beforehand, before we hit record, about community, which is a nice flow on from discussing shaman versus animism and all the rest of it. Um, One of the things just in between that chat and now that occurs to me is that at the moment, for better and for worse, we have kind of like the full range of community on display at this point. We've got angry
Yeah.
mob on one hand to like clandestine groups of neighbors keeping their favorite bars and restaurants afloat, speakeasy style. We have, which seems almost ironic, but not, because this is what happens if you try to suppress something like an archetype. We actually, in many respects, have community in abundance, which is a strange way of thinking about it. But my way in, I think, is to the question, or get your feedback, because this is something you're very experienced in, is some of them work and some of them don't. And I'm glad some of them work, and I'm very glad some of them don't. Um, we've seen over the last year and a half, maybe even 5 years, really, almost like the full range of methods of organizing and communing, right? So what are we, from your experience and what it is that you do and what you're called to do, what are we potentially leaving, or like leaving on the table, or otherwise missing in, I guess, robust community building? And I guess a lot of that is because of the sort of inherited worldview we've all grown up in. But what are your observations about things we can do to um, have more authentic, more flourishing, healthier communing, dare I say?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, my community in particular was a little backwards with this, in that before we didn't go at it thinking, okay, how do we create healthy community? What happened was um, when the teachings of the cycle of transformation were created, about 30 years ago, through Christina Pratt's, initiatory experiences that she had at the time, and sort of kind of a classical initiatory experience of being driven to the point of total, insanity or death, and having to use your tools and your relationship with your helping spirit to translate what they're telling you so you can live. Um, our community received the message about 10 years in very strongly from the helping spirits, and it's kept being repeated and repeated and repeated, that the teachings needed to be offered in a way that was in alignment with the teachings. And so we could only ever actually express and really live these teachings in the world of how to enter into deep authenticity and spiritual adulthood if we were actually willing to offer them in community versus a spiritual consumerism model. And to summarize, my last 10 years in community and learnings, I would just say what I've seen, I've understood the reason for that now, over these last 10 years, because there's ways that in having, and it's a non-local community. It's not like a local in-person community. It's a non-local community that meets maybe at the retreats if you're actively engaged in the teachings, or during our yearly gathering. But then we're constantly having, clearing calls weekly, engaging the process that's in my book of the deep liberation process to, support each other in engaging with our life as a teacher. We're working on councils because the community is led by council, and we're um, essentially, on a weekly basis trying to manifest the vision of the community together using our tools. And if I wasn't involved in the community in that way, in this way of leading and teaching and sharing in community on a weekly basis, then it would have been just like this vacation I was going on to have this peak experience, for a week, and then going home and back into the, chaos of the contemporary world where I just have to sort of compartmentalize my cute little spiritual stuff and go on with my life. But this community created enough of a container of this other reality, this other world we were creating and living in together through the sustained, consistent application of our tools and taking risks with each other, entering into vulnerability and intimacy and engaging in shared group ritual and just trying to actually make concrete things happen, because the teachings are held by the community versus by one leader or something. So we have to like literally, make sure the retreats are being produced every day and the community members have all their needs tended to. And so if I wasn't having that bubble of this other world that I would never have been able to feel into my purpose and my authenticity and my power and my vision to the level that I have, because I would have just been stuck in the broken culture that I'm in. So like I needed this bridge to know how to weave wholeness in that broken culture. And so that's to me, that's one of the biggest gifts of the community, that we can create these kind of autonomous magical zones where more is possible than is possible in the current consensus reality that we're living in. And it becomes much harder to hijack our process as individuals when that process is held in community with people who are actually seeing how you're showing up on a weekly basis. It's much harder to bullshit ourselves and to hide and to fall into old patterns when you're not expected to show up well once a week or 2 weeks out of the year, but every week out of the year.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I actually thinking on it, I'm sure a lot of the premium members find a lot of resonance in that, Langston. How do you how does, so with that in mind, so the community you participate in there, how do you view that? I like that it, on the one hand, it sort of provides depth and strength and experience, so that in other communities, or local engagement in a physical or neighborhood sense, or other things that you may be involved in, how do you see them overlapping, and how are they in, dare I say, relation? Like, is it as clunky? I know it isn't. This is a leading question, but is it as clunky as, well, I developed these skills of what is asked of me and what I ask of community in a robust and healthy and moving sense within the shamanic community, and so I can kind of just know how to do that elsewhere? Or is there more of an overlap than that?
Hmm. That's a good question. I think on one hand, it's it's that, yes, it is that the fact that as you're taking these risks and leading yourself on the path of your, healing and the path of your work to bring your unique genius out into the world in community, it makes it much easier to do that in other places when you can take risks in a space where you're not going to get fired if you fuck up, or you're going to be held in love and given a strong invitation to transform versus being suddenly like, exiled or banished if you don't measure up in some way. There's this ability, we do have beliefs and principles and shared commitments that we're agreeing to live by, but there's a lot of invitations that are given to growth and transformation and being held in your process, that as long as you're willing to actually show up and be seeking that transformation, the community is willing to hold you in that and try to support you in that process. And so that then just naturally does spill over into your life if you let it, because and it also helps that the work we're doing isn't just like, how to ascend and become, I'm so sick of this word, like 5D shaman, like this I don't even know where that comes from or who's been sharing that with the world, but there's this ascension idea of which I think is the antithesis of any indigenous shamanic tradition of like trying to escape reality in some way. We're not doing that kind of work. Our work is grounded in how humans can transform and come into deeper relationship with life, all of life. And so in that, naturally, you're having to bring in the stuff of your life into community. And so naturally, the stuff of your life is where your transformational process is happening and where you're reaching out to community for support with as well. So it's not like there's this big demarcation between my life and my community. It's like they're part of each other. And then within that, there's also conscious ways that I think we're still working to feel into how we could be engaging our tools better to meet collectively the fractures that are visible in our local communities, in addition to our current, non-local community. And I think we're still, as a community, becoming the people who can do that. I don't know that we've really skillfully done that yet.
Well, that's disappointing because I wanted you to answer it for me, because I'm sitting amongst the membership and obviously Permaculture Tasmania and some Indigenous festivals that I'm helping and involved in here, and other kind of Indigenous stuff going on in South America that we're assisting in and participating in. And I have as Alan Savory's holistic framework as my model for this, where rather than compartmentalizing it, you can kind of have nested holes instead for it. But I think it's, we're getting close to it, which is it's that avoiding ascension thing. If you're in a shamanic context or you're operating under a shamanic mode, you're not actually operating under a shamanic mode unless you are engaging in that right relation sense. So I think that's where I was going with it. Like, it's more than just the experience. It's that they're mutually, how to describe this? It's right relation to be in a non-local magic shamanism community thing only if it has the other. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's a piece I'm looking for here, and again, going back to permaculture, there's this idea that you should be a guild in place and a rhizome in the world. And I'm looking for something like that. I think are there things
Yes.
we get kind of wrong in environmental activist groups or something? It just seems like I think they're operating out of a world story, to use Charles Eisenstein's term, that is not helpful, or dare I say, even guarantees a lack of success. And it just, I'm there too. I think we have to learn it by doing, but I need to know. I was wondering if you had any tips on what that kind of stuff would look like, because I'm involved in groups that look like my magic, but many of them don't have it. Permaculture especially just doesn't have it. And nevertheless, they don't realize they actually do. And it's not like you need to like magic up permaculture. It's more I'm looking for how my frameworks relate so that they help each other, I guess.
Yeah, that's a really important question. When we get Well, I have a lot of ways I can think of this conversation can go on. The discursive way of my mind often works, but one thing that comes to mind is definitely one of our visions as a community, and in the vision of my book and these teachings and sharing them through this book, is that it will help people to gain the resilience needed to move into the fractures and weave wholeness there. So it's not just about becoming more comfortable. Like I said, I think I said this already. It's not about becoming more comfortable in a broken culture, but actually being able to consciously feel resourced to move into the discomfort of these gaps and create change there. And so, how do we do that? Well, in my way of looking at things, the first step is having some kind of tool to deeply change the stories you carry within yourself that are complicit with the harmful stories that are running the systems we're in. And so you need to, on that inner permaculture level, on that inner landscape level, being able to have tools that allow you to sustainably engage with your life and transform those fear-based stories into stories that are more in alignment with what's actually happening in life around us and what's actually wanting to happen through us. But then after that, the next step I would say is perhaps, and this is sort of following the years of our teachings and also the sort of online courses I currently offer in the ecosystem of the sort of Last Mass Center online that I teach in. And the next step is shadow work. And when I use the term shadow work, I'm not just talking about this work of withdrawing projections and seeing what's in our unconscious. Like that's already the process I'm talking about engaging life with a teacher. That's all laid out really clearly in the book, Deep Liberation. But then the next step is the kind of shadow work that involves reclaiming these parts of yourself that were shoved down into your unconscious and locked away and the key thrown away during different moments of your life when you were made to think, if I embody this part of myself, I will die. And then they grow, twisted and monstrous over time and start hijacking us through sabotage and, patterns of sabotage, patterns of fear, patterns of intense attraction. And if we're not doing that work, the second we start to move um, into these sites of wounding in our culture, the archons, if you want to use that Gnostic terminology, just flip the shadow switch and everyone starts being afraid of each other and angry at each other and scared. It's like it just turns into a mess and things dissolve, which I'm sure you've seen. I've certainly seen many times in my life happen as people work to move towards these sites where change could happen, these sort of fulcrums or pivot points where change could happen at a cultural level. And so then I think if you've really succeeded in having these tools to withdraw projections and tools to engage the shadow, what's the next tool of the archon, so to speak, is the ancestral baggage, the centuries of ancestral trauma that from unresolved ancestors that haven't been moved on, that haven't been tended well, that are unconsciously possessing us as they try to resolve their unresolved lives through us. And so I think a lot of our focus as a community and in our online classes has been how can we really start giving people these tools that cultivate the type of resilience so that you're not vulnerable to those particular ways movements are dissolved almost instantaneously and power becomes abused and people end up generating exactly what they're trying to fix and we haven't and we're just starting to move into the place over the next year or so of looking at, okay, now that we've spent some years training people in these tools and seeing what works and what doesn't work, how do we begin mobilizing people who are ready, who have these skills of resilience, both in our communities and in other communities as well, to actually move into some of these sites of fracture?
It's excellent. Yeah, I needed to hear a lot of that. I like the developing resilience to move to that side of fracture, and also that yeah, you do get that arc on switch when you get close to places that can potentially generate cultural change or community change. So that's good to know with some of the stuff that we navigate. And I also think it comes back to the solutionism thing, just to add to it. It's good that you say, like, well, we don't know yet what the next year or so looks like as we move with these frameworks into additional relational context or further relation with others. Um, and that's how it's supposed to be, because if we did know, it's actually not, you're not operating from the framework, you're still operating from a solutionistic planning framework, which has the iconic assumption of control and all knowledge, and all knowledge in that fixed state rather than flowing state. So that's good. I like that. That was I'm certainly gonna sit with that with what I have to do this year. That's for sure.
Yeah, and one other thing I can speak to that as well, just comes to mind, is like the way the word Watiko gets thrown around, I think is very problematic as well, because I think it relates to that conversation of the archon switch, and so to speak. It's like the second we start saying, oh, these people are possessed by Watiko, or oh, this person is like the embodiment of Watiko, we become Watiko, because it's literally the force of cannibalistic othering and
Yes.
seeing things as separate than us. So in my sense, these tools are also the answer to how do we acknowledge what is harmful and what needs to change without holding ourselves as separate from those systems we're seeking to change. How, from acknowledging that we are part of these systems, that collectives are simply made up of the individuals that are part of that collective. And so we all, to varying degrees, embody the harm that we're wanting to address and ameliorate in our culture. How do we engage our tools in community and support each other in moving out of the projection and blindness of the ways we're embodying that harm, and hold each other deeply accountable and moving into more and more authentic embodiment of just the beauty of what it is to be human, like what it is to be human, not being this boring thing, but this experience that the world is already enchanted. To me, like that's what it is to be human in an indigenous context, to be resting into the seat of your being enough to feel how all around you are conversations that are always happening and trying to happen through you as well. That you're part of this vast system that is wanting you to take your rightful place as an essential part of all of the organism of all of life. And that when we're actually in our humanity, like what I think is our state of normal, but that which is very different from what's become normalized, the kind of pathologized way of being in the world that's become our normal. When we're in that actual true normal of just our basic humanity, there's no need to enchant the world because the world's already enchanted.
Very nice, and also a really good, probably a really, really nice and profound place to finish up, sir. So, Deep Liberation, where can they get it, etc., and also other stuff you got going on and where people can find you.
Sure, yeah, thank you. So Deep Liberation should be available pretty much at any bookseller that you want to go to. It's it's available on Amazon and on Kindle and on all the other usual suspects of places to buy books. Uh, I'm going to be having a book launch party on the 19th, which anyone is welcome to come to. You can find info about that on my website, or I'll give you the link as well, Gordon, for the show notes. And what's coming up aside from that launch party, where we're going to be sort of, in the US, it's the eve of the inauguration. So we're going to be engaging some liberatory practices just to dream into the future we're wanting to create in this moment of transition. And beyond that, where I'm also going to be talking about how people might engage the book to form what I call deep liberation circles in communities you already have or communities you want to form, where you can use the book to start learning to engage these tools, maybe other tools that you have to support each other in a practice of freedom, in a practice of stepping into deeper and deeper freedom and wholeness and power together, and cultivating the kind of resilience I've been talking about. And another just support for people wanting to do that is the online classes that I offer through the Last Mass Center. Um, One of them will be coming up starting February 9th, which is Energy Body Mastery, which is sort of kind of like the first half of the book, which is a lot about how do we cultivate this, how do we cultivate our humanity? How do we cultivate our ability to be deeply grounded in our body and in relationship with the earth, to be connected to the above and that cosmic sense of the stars and the planets and the sun, and the protection that comes out of that cosmic perspective? How do we create healthy, intelligent, flexible boundaries? And how do we then move inwards and engage with the aspects of self that are constantly making choices in opposition to being grounded or in opposition to having healthy boundaries because of experiences we've had in the past? And how do you then engage those tools to continuously upgrade your energy body as you grow and change over the course of your life?
Very nice. So that's Last Mask Center. That's the book. What about your own stuff? Where can people reach out to you, find you, and so on?
Yes, so you can find me on my website. I'm a little bit in transition right now. So right now my website is occupy-your-heart.com. The new website is going to be langstonkahn.com. But right now they just redirect to each other anyway. So
Oh, there you go. That was, yeah.
yeah.
With those, yes. Probably should have been Langston Kahn from the beginning. That's why I asked the heart question.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
But soon it
Totally.
will be. There you go.
Yep. Yep.
Awesome. Oh, well, I mean, I adore you, sir, and this is such a great chat. And congratulations on the book. It's a cracking read, and yeah, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Gordon. It's always so much fun to talk to you.